I'm very pleased that the National AI Plan is out there. It does give us a direction and almost, if you like, a sort of a roadmap or an approach that we can all get behind and understand our part to play in it. There are national considerations around how we think about our own sovereignty, our privacy, and how we think about our value as a country in the global ecosystem. And then there's a technology that's moving so much faster than any government or any organization is really able to keep up. And I mean, globally, I mean, it's happening in every country that, there isn't one perfect model, but, we can look at what China has done. We can look at what Singapore's done, what Canada's done, what the UK's done. And I think that leads back to what Australia did here. And luckily being in part of the government for the last 8 months, I can see some of this happening. The approach has been, what is the best of everything else that we can take? But looking at the UK's sort of sectoral regulator approach, looking at the US's, let's call it sort of let it rip approach, looking at China's actually very pragmatic approach to specific issues of data generation, of misinformation. There's a little bit to take from all of them. And then that's the approach, which I think is actually a really good approach. So you look at the plan itself, it really talks to three key things, which is how do we capture this benefit for Australia as part of this global momentum? How do we get our share of that opportunity pie that the world is creating? There's opportunity there for Australians to benefit from us having technology here in our country and investments in here in our country and opportunities to access that in our country.
Welcome to the AI Grapple podcast. My name is Kate vanderVoort, founder and CEO of the AI Success Lab. Today I'm joined by Lee Hickin, Executive Director of Australia's National AI Centre. Lee has spent more than 3 decades in the tech industry, including senior roles at Microsoft and AWS, and he had a front row seat to the early development of ChatGPT and the rise of generative AI. In this conversation, we unpack where Australia really sits on AI adoption, why our national AI strategy has taken a lighter touch, pro-innovation approach, and how businesses can move past fear and experimentation into real value. We also talk about data security, ecosystem lock-in, the environmental impact of AI, and where Australia has a genuine opportunity to lead globally. If you're a business leader trying to balance innovation, governance, and long-term strategy, this is an episode you don't want to miss. Let's dive right in. Hi, Lee. Welcome to the AI Grapple.
Hi. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for having me.
Why don't you start by giving us just a little bit about your background and how it is that you've come to be the Executive Director at the National AI Centre here in Australia?
Sure. I'll try and condense it to the shorter version of it. And some days I pinch myself that this is actually where I am and what I do and the opportunity that I've been given in this life. Look, as I said, I'll give you the condensed version of it, but I was lucky enough. I've spent my entire career in tech. Since I joined IBM in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's just been in tech. I've been a software engineer, product manager, and CTO at Microsoft. And I had a moment in 2014. I took a role at Microsoft as the product manager for the IoT, Internet of Things product that was sort of coming around at that time. And almost as an aside, they said to me, oh, by the way, can you also look after this thing called advanced analytics? This is a new product area we're going to get into, which, for those of you who remember your history, was sort of just around the time that something called Project Oxford, which was Microsoft's foray into AI, kicked off. And so we had a suite of AI products. And I genuinely didn't really understand much about it, didn't have much interest in it because I was an IoT guy. That was my thing. I was really deeply into that. But I did that for a little while. I actually left Microsoft, went to Amazon, worked in Singapore for 2 years doing IoT, and came back to Microsoft as the CTO in 2019. And I was handed this sort of portfolio of products. And one of them was a product called GPT-2. And it was this sort of interesting area that Microsoft was getting into. They were working with this little company called OpenAI that was an Elon Musk organization at the time. And sort of exploring with it and figuring out what we could do with it. And I just found myself sort of, as most people were at the time when ChatGPT launched, drawn to this interesting tech that was not like any other technology I've ever worked with in my time. It was sort of quite unique. We'll probably get into some of the reasons why it's so unique. But I found myself in that. And of course, I was just so lucky to be at Microsoft from 2018, 2019 through to 2024 or 5 when I left to join this role. So I lived through that moment of GPT-2, GPT-3, GPT 3.5, Interpret GPT, and then the launch of ChatGPT. And I had an interesting seat because I was sitting at Microsoft, and as most of your listeners would know, there was an interest. The relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI through the launch of GPT was quite something in terms of that a moment for Microsoft. And I had a front row seat to this. I was right there at that time, so I got access to some of this technology early. And very quickly, from sort of that journey, I became the AI guy. My role as the CTO at Microsoft pivoted from being the broad technology across Microsoft's entire portfolio to sort of this myopic focus on this GPT moment. I've said the launch of Copilot, the launch of GPT-4. I did world tours of trying to talk about GPT. And, it just became such a big part of my life. I was looking for the next thing to do. I sort of not run my course at Microsoft, but I'd done a lot of things, and I was looking for the next opportunity. And this opportunity knocked on my door. And why wouldn't you want to be in the seat that takes the opportunity to lead Australia on its journey towards an AI, powered nation and an AI opportunity space with all of the considerations? And so I said yes. I left private sector of 33 years, joined public sector of 8 months now. Boy, that was a journey. And here I find myself, yes, as the executive director for the National AI Centre, a team of 20 people around the country, running within the Department of Industry with the sole purpose, and hopefully we'll talk a bit more about this, but the sole purpose of helping all Australians, but particularly our small to medium businesses, on their journey towards using AI in a way that is powerful and positive for them, their business, and the people they employ.
Wow, what a journey. And how much has changed since, those early GPT models?
It's crazy. I was sort of thinking about our conversation today and thinking, I know we still talk about it being just a few years ago, the 2022 moment, but even just looking at the technology, it's hard to imagine now, but think back to what ChatGPT looked like when it first appeared, November 30th, 2022, and we all looked at it and started talking to it, to where we are today. That is not just product development. That is leaps and bounds of exponential growth in a technology domain that in my nearly 35 years now in this industry, I don't think I've ever seen anything that's comparable.
What's really incredible to me about that is every workshop I run, there are still people in the room that haven't yet had their ChatGPT moment. And that's what's incredible to me, is looking at how far it's come in that just over 3 years, and that there are still people that haven't even experienced that yet. It's quite incredible.
It is. And it's, in some ways that's a humbling moment, and something I felt really acutely coming into the government is this sort of, in Microsoft, you have a somewhat of a myopic view because your audience is tech people who are buying technology from a tech company, and they expect a certain thing. So you're already on this sort of level of kind of this journey with the AI. But now sitting in this role and trying to help all Australians, it's really humbling to remember that, you live in this privileged world where we get to play with tech, but not everybody has that. And that's something that, I take pretty seriously here, is that our job is not to just make tech, AI in particular, suitable for Metro Australia and all the people that are using tech today. We've got to reach everybody. You've got to talk to every Australian. And that's not easy, but it's the right thing to do.
I had a really interesting conversation in an episode a few weeks ago with the CEO of the Smith family. And I was not aware of just how many children still don't have access to what we take really for granted, particularly in business. So it is a very interesting time in Australia. So I'd love to dive into, with where you sit at the National AI Centre, how does Australia's AI adoption and readiness compare to other major economies like the US, Europe, and Asia? And are we keeping pace, or are we falling behind? Because I think for some of us that work in this space who are really tapped into what's happening globally, it can feel a bit like Australia's a bit behind. So from your perspective, where's Australia at right now?
Look, it's yes, it's a well-trodden path. I mean, and as you say, it's kind of, when you look at the big numbers and you look at these global scales, the index, the Stanford index and others, and look at where Australia is, you would get that perception that we are behind. And I think there's a couple of things to pick up on that. One of which is we're categorizing it like it's a race, like there's a competition to be won, and winners and losers will be drawn, and there's sort of something to be achieved by being the winner. And I'm not discounting the fact that there is something of a race towards the maximizing your opportunity of it, but I don't think there's any winners and losers in this race. So I kind of, setting aside the where are we on that, and we'll get to that, let's not kind of worry that just because we are moving at a different pace to other countries, Doesn't mean we're losing opportunity. It just means we're probably creating a different set of challenges for ourselves in the future. But historically, and you probably know this yourself, Kate, is you look at all of the major tech trends that we've sort of sat through over the last 20, 30 years, the big ones, sort of the race towards virtualization and commoditization of tech and tin in sort of data centers, mobile phone adoption, cloud adoption. On all of those scales, Australia has always been a front runner. We're the largest adopter of virtualization at the time. I was working at Microsoft, pushing Hyper-V and competing with VMware. Australia was leaps and bounds ahead of other countries. So it's not like we are inherently a tech laggard and we generally don't want to jump on these things. We're actually very good at it. What bothers me a bit with these statistics that we see is they sort of tell the story that the author's trying to tell. And so it can seem like Australia isn't moving quickly because in real terms, we're a fairly small economy on the global scale when you compare us to the major economies. And we do have a sense of trepidation in I think in our general discourse on AI. You would sense it, that people are sort of nervous of the impact, the risk, the damage, the danger. They're focused quite a lot more on that than they are on the opportunity. But if you actually look at the numbers, and there's a whole bunch of stats, and I can happily share them with you, we'll put them in the show notes. But I mean, in general terms, something like 46, 47% of Australians are using Gen AI every week. That's 12.5 million Australians are using generative AI every week. That's not laggard. That's not falling behind. That's actually pretty solid and pretty strong. We're seeing the same sort of measures in industry and in business. I think the KPMG report that you're probably aware of that came out a little while ago, University of Melbourne, KPMG one, still called out that like 65% of us see that our employers and our places of employment are using AI. So how are we stacking up on adoption? It's hard to measure sort of apples with apples because comparing ourselves to, say, South Korea or China or Singapore or even Canada and the UK to a certain extent, just from an economic point of view, it's a bit of an unfair advantage. I would say that per capita and across our broad spectrum and in the places where it matters, because the other really important one is I got a 19-year-old son at uni and I can see I got a younger daughter finishing high school. The way that AI is finding its way into their world and becoming such a central part of that, the next generation of Australians and working Australians, this is going to be an exponentially higher. So I actually think our adoption rates are pretty good per capita. They stack up. I just think it's a bit unfair to compare us to other countries because we just don't always look like other countries.
Yeah, that's really fair. I appreciate that lens because when you are sort of at the front of it and seeing all the advancements and how fast things are moving, sometimes the fish pond can feel a bit smaller here in Australia, but I really appreciate that perspective because it's good to put it in perspective.
Look, and I think it's important because what it does is if we keep reading this, there's a sort of a self-perpetuating reality to this. If we keep reading that Australia's falling behind, that, the government's not doing enough or industry's not moving fast enough or we're not taking enough care with the safety concerns and people are losing jobs. And, there's narratives in that are based in some perception of reality. Like we know that AI has an impact on work, for example. There's no question about that. It has an impact on work because it changes work, changes jobs, changes roles. But because we accentuate this narrative that it has a negative impact on work, and then we marry that up with and Australia's not doing enough, and then we marry that up with Australia's falling behind narrative, and you get these mixed tones that are like, hey, we need to do more because we're falling behind, but don't do too much because that's dangerous and we'll scare everybody. And you end up in this stasis, this sort of paralysis position where, well, what do we do? And, not to break this all about me, but part of the work that we want to do at the National AI Centre is sort of break that paralysis, break that stasis, tell a more coherent, balanced story of, yes, there are risks, but they're appropriate risks. Yes, there are things you need to do to be safe, but those things you need to do are not become a data science organization and invest in massive infrastructure to do that. Sometimes they're very practical steps. And the opportunities are not AI smarter than a Harvard professor, but actually AI can help you smooth out some of the processes in your business. It can help you do little things. And I think we forget that it's not the big things that AI can do, which is amazing, when we think about its work in science and biochemical and biomechanics and medicine and everything else. Sometimes it's the little things, like it just helps me respond to more customers quickly, give me a slightly more personalized customer experience. And that balance is lost, I think, sometimes in these big narratives of failure, of risk, or falling behind.
One of my mentors always used to say, pioneers get shot and settlers get rich. And it kind of plays out here, because when you think about what we used to have to do 3 years ago, even in prompting, and how we had to wrangle AI and all of the steps you had to go through to sticky tape things together, and how different that is now. For those who are only entering in now, they haven't had to do all of that harder work. So I
Yes.
guess, the natural point to start is when it makes sense for the business or for the person that's using AI. So just to touch on
And
one of the other things that you were saying there around um, moving from, I guess, this experimentation to scaling. So a lot of Australian businesses, we find this a lot with our clients, are still really experimenting with AI rather than looking at how to scale that across. So a bit to what you're speaking about, there are the small high impact ways that we can use it, and then there's whole of operation approaches to AI. What do you see as the main barriers that Australian organisations and businesses are dealing with in that landscape of how to move from pilot to scale, or how to move from the AI dabble to being more strategic, which is what we talk about a lot?
yeah, dabble is probably a good descriptor of it. Look, I mean, obviously it's hard for me to speak so broadly across all of Australia to kind of draw that, but some of the work we do here at the National AI Centre is to try and sort of take a pulse and measure that momentum and that adoption rate. So we have our AI adoption tracker, which is a sort of a monthly recurring pulse check, if you like, on that adoption. And we have a responsible AI index report, which sort of looks at people's adoption of a responsible AI process and its impact on use of AI. And then more broadly, the ecosystem report, which sort of looks at how big is the market in Australia. And I think there's a few things that we've managed to extrapolate from that, which will be no surprise to your listeners, but kind of points towards what we kind of understood, but now we understand and can address. And most of the inhibiting factors for people in moving faster with AI, because I think there's actually quite a massive scale of people doing that experimentation, as you say, and kind of figuring out what it means for them. The challenge is for them is they get that toe in the water, and I'm speaking broadly here, so not any specifics. They get the toe in the water, and they either, without someone to kind of guide them towards the nuance of prompting in the right ways or solving the right problems or actually using it to do something useful. It's one thing for a small business owner to kind of be taught by their nephew or niece, how you can go create recipes and figure out how to solve problems and ask questions. But to actually go, I have a challenge in my business day to day, which is I can't get enough time to talk to all my customers and manage all my quotes and deal with all of the work that I need to backlog. Without solving a problem, they kind of do that first experimentation. I think it's cool, but it's not for me. Like, it's not going to, this isn't for plumbing. This isn't for painting. This isn't for the legal industry. What would I do with this? So they lack that kind of clarity of this is applicability. This is what it is for you. And then, coupled with that is they're doing the work and they're kind of going, this is great, but like I just did this and this is completely wrong. This answer is actually not right, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to correct it. And there's a sort of an overinflated thinking that because it's wrong, it could be catastrophically wrong. Like, oh my gosh, this information's now on the internet and has a potential to continuate. So I better stop doing this. There's a risk there. So we get these two barriers of the risk of failure, bad outcomes, being something I'm not, and I don't have enough time and skills to learn how to navigate around that. The other thing is what you mentioned just a second ago, Kate, which is what I think about as the complexity gap, because AI has gone from being something that, okay, you just type a few prompts and you get some responses back. It's fairly self-contained. It doesn't search the internet. It doesn't try and answer questions, that it's not agentic. It's not going to try and do all this stuff. To suddenly now AI, and we use that term just to describe a raft of kind of capabilities, not just generative AI, of course, but, sort of more traditional predictive sort of AI models, but we just call it AI. And now people are kind of looking at it going, my goodness, like, where do I start? I can have this AI run around, read all my emails, respond on my behalf, and book me a massage on the weekend. And I just wanted to do the simple things. So it's become such a gap to get to the point where you're effective with it. People don't know what to do with it when they do get into it. And that has created this sort of ability to get lots of experimentation, but the chasm to get to actual building out something and doing something properly with it is so hard now to do. It's very hard for people to do that. And the evidence points to all this. We've seen this in all the reports and it's particularly acute in our small to medium business sector. It's particularly acute in the sort of 1 to 20 employee small business sector of the market. We go up to sort of 99 and then from 99 to 200, and you start to see increasing capability because they've got scale and people and time. But at that small end, which is actually where the need is most, most small businesses, you go and talk to any small business owner, they'll tell you that administrative work, paperwork, customer service, and all that is the thing that drowns them. That's where it could have the most value. So I think helping people know why AI is useful to them is one step. I think, that helps people kind of go, right, if I can, I want to solve that problem. I can see something that matters to me, so I'm willing to invest the time to learn. Because if you don't know what problem it is you're going to solve, you're certainly not going to invest time to learn it. And if I know that the hurdle to risk management is not massive money and time, but it's actually just, for example, I'm a small business, maybe you just need to put on your website a disclaimer. We use AI in our work. If you have any issues with anything we've said, please contact us at this email address. That kind of stuff. It's the simple stuff that's transparency appropriate, not kind of on the big scale of it. So yeah, I think that's generally what I'm seeing. And I'll just round that out with a kind of a point of view, because that's actually the job of the National AI Center. Give people their confidence to adopt AI in a way that matters to them. How do we give them the capability to not be afraid of it, to have the skills to kind of keep moving forward, the fluency to know enough to know that you're not going to cause harm, but you can just keep experimenting. And then, of course, the clarity of the environment you're operating in. These are the rules of the game. This is what the government says. This is what the industry bodies say. This is what the regulators are saying. That confidence, that capability, and that clarity are the cornerstones of our work.
It's really interesting, and maybe I'm just working, well, I guess I am working with the early adopters, but I actually find, as someone who's deep in the AI education, literacy, consulting kind of space, the smaller businesses they see the opportunity, they jump on it, they are so ready to innovate and implement and integrate into their businesses. And just anecdotally from my business, in the first year, the first 12 months of us, after we'd kind of moved more into the AI space, we probably had 100 proposals out to larger businesses who had come to us asking for some of the AI consulting, AI education services, and no one was ready to make a decision. And so while we were sitting around waiting for everybody to do that, my smaller business community, after I swore I would never run a membership and online courses again, were begging for support they just wanted to get started. They had a lot less red tape, a lot less concerns about governance and data security, because it wasn't as big of an impact in that SMB space in some industries. And they have just been so willing. So we've been running our membership for a year. They've been so willing and so eager to implement. And I love working with them for that very reason, that they don't put up a lot of the barriers. So I know that they're the early adopters who have, jumped in early. So it'll be fabulous as the National AI Centre rolls out your education piece as well, to really get more and more businesses familiar with AI and to get really tangible and practical. Because, even in our business, we've got 100 half-finished automations where we've sticky taped things together and they've never quite worked, or there's still a bottleneck somewhere. And so if that's happening in our company, it's absolutely happening in other places as well.
No doubt. And you're absolutely right. And it's the real shame of it all is those small businesses that stand to gain so much, because AI to me is, it's sort of at either ends. There's massive things we can do, like, cure cancer and that kind of stuff. But there's actually little things we can do, just giving people back an hour in their day, which means they spend time with their family, or they're just a bit more productive. And that's the small business, piece of it. So I think that's where we've got to get to. And I should point out, the National AI Centre is sort of supremely focused on this, but we're not trying to do this alone. That's not a scaling factor we can do. So Australia has a fairly rich sort of cohort of professional associations, things like COSBOA, as well as the sort of the legal practice and bookkeepers association and others that try to support those small businesses. And we look to them as very much partners in crime here to help us scale this out and bring appropriateness and bring the message to everyone.
Yeah, and that's a lot of our work at the moment too, is with those sort of peak bodies who I really believe have got a responsibility to bring those industries along on what's going to be a fairly steep learning curve and a bit of a bumpy ride for some of those businesses too. So at the end of last year, we saw the National AI Plan introduced here in Australia, which is fabulous. It's great to have some sort of national guidance around that. So what was interesting to me when all of that came out was that we've taken a really light touch, pro-innovation approach that relies on adapting existing laws rather than creating new AI-specific regulations. So I'd love to talk about that a bit more. So for business leaders in particular, what does this approach mean for the adoption and deployment of AI? And then let's explore a bit about the plan and the practicalities of that.
Sure. Yeah. Look, yes, I'm very pleased that the National AI Plan is out there. It does give us a direction and almost, if you like, a sort of a roadmap an approach that we can all get behind and understand our part to play in it. And that's, if you kind of, at a high level, what I think the National AI Plan, to my mind, says, and to be fair, the National AI Plan is not the body of work from the National AI Centre. We don't write it. It's the minister's plan. It's the government's plan. But we're all party to help build the right plan. That's the work we do with ourselves and the rest of the department and across government. And the big picture thinking of the National AI Plan is to balance the need for creating space for opportunity to grow. So not building up too much of a set of barriers such that businesses start to question more about what are they not able to do versus what can they do. But doing that in balance with this kind of very clear and important need for Australians to feel like there's a safety sense built into this, that privacy is being thought about, that copyright is being thought about, that data is being thought about, that sort of the longer term impacts of AI are being considered. And so, flagstone announcement in the National AI Plan was the plan to establish the AI Safety Institute as a part of this sort of, if you think of it, our ecosystem of AI infrastructure in the government. So that's the plan. It's about making sure that it's about striking the balance. And it's also about recognizing that one piece of the government. So, we're part of Department of Industry. The Department of Industry, Science and Resources puts out the plan, but recognizing that the plan needs to have the input and the participation of the entire ecosystem. We need all the regulators, all of the other government departments and industry to be helping to shape this collectively. I think if we look at the way sort of something like the EU AI Act appeared as a sort of a very extreme counterpoint, which is, sort of ex ante singular law that catches everything before we've decided before we've ever tested a law, we just build a law and set it in place.
Before we even understand what the technology is that we're building the law around.
Built before even generative AI even was kind of a thing. So yes, I mean, very different environment. But I mean, and whilst on one half that can look like great safety construct, right? The rules are set, we know what we can do. What it's actually falling afoul of is it's now having to be not dismantled, but almost rebuilt around a world that was not designed yet. We haven't finished building AI. I mean, it's kind of like that. We're on day one of the year of AI and we're so far away from what we might be doing. So, it's important to not do something that is unwindable. And that's always the concern with hard law, is it's hard to unwind. So it
can I
provides
just
that.
add in before you move on from the EU? I think what's really interesting about what's happened there is I have a lot of colleagues in the EU and they don't get access to a lot of the either whole platforms or major functionality within those platforms. And so their legislation's been so restrictive that it's actually really starting to affect businesses there and how they can use AI. We certainly, that's swinging the pendulum one way.
For sure.
So, yes, I'm really glad we
Yeah.
didn't go down that path.
Yeah. Look, and I think most people would, well, I certainly, from a personal point of view, I think that was probably too far down one way. But I think nobody would argue that there is somewhere to be gained in the right place, a balance between the regulation that is appropriate and considered and maybe sector specific. There are national considerations around how we think about our own sovereignty, our privacy, and how we think about our value as a country in the global ecosystem. And then there's a technology that's moving so much faster than any government or any organization is really able to keep up. And I mean globally, it's happening in every country. That, there isn't one perfect model. The EU is just a really easy one to pick on because it's so much of a sort of a figurehead. But, we can look at what China has done. We can look at what Singapore's done, what Canada's done, what the UK's done. And I think that leads back to what Australia did here. And luckily being in part of the government for the last 8 months, I can see some of this happening. The approach has been, what is the best of everything else that we can take? Because other people have been doing this. One of the advantages of coming into the race, at a sort of second phase, is you can lean in and learn from what's happened. And so looking at the UK's sort of sectoral regulator approach, looking at the US's let's call it sort of let it rip approach, looking at China's actually very pragmatic approach to specific issues of data generation, of misinformation. There's a little bit to take from all of them. And then that's the approach, which I think is actually a really good approach. So you look at the plan itself, it really talks to three key things, which is how do we capture this benefit for Australia as part of this global momentum? How do we get our share of that opportunity pie that the world is creating? There's opportunity there for Australians to benefit from us having technology here in our country and investments in here in our country and opportunities to access that in our country. There's the spreading the benefits bit, which I've talked about earlier, and this is sort of the large domain of the National AI Centre, is how do we make sure that all Australians have access to it, whether that's the literacy and the fluency to know how to use it, physical access to the technology itself, and understand the value it brings to them. And then, of course, the last is that keep it safe and establishment of the AISI and a continued focus on making sure that we learn how to use AI and the technology, but at the same time, we learn how to manage the use of AI governance in appropriate ways. And, it's probably a rat hole, so I'll say it, and then you can choose whether you want to take us down it. Much of the challenges we see around the world with AI causing harm or bleeding into areas of sort of concern are through poor human deployment, usage of, or inappropriate, because they don't have the full picture, use of AI in domains where it's used. I mean, to me, a great example is, we look at some of these, I think the great one was very early on, the lawyer in the US that sort of wrote his papers using ChatGPT and got it to provide a bunch of case references and example case taught that would explain why his particular client should get off. And of course, actually, we would argue it's a fantastic use of AI to go through a very complex data-driven written process to help you do that. That saves countless hours of expensive lawyer time. But what that lawyer didn't know is that you might have to check that for its validity, for hallucinations. That's a little bit of knowledge that if that person had known that, then they have the skills to not do what they did. Now, they may have chosen then to be, to do it anyway, and that's a human decision. But the point is, the AI itself wasn't the problem in that scenario. It was the way that the person used the AI that is the problem. So when I think about keeping us safe, from my lens, that is as much about making sure that, there's a sort of a national sovereign safety, and we think about our country and our privacy and our data. But keeping us safe is actually about helping us all know how to use this new thing that we have. It's like learning to drive a car or getting an airplane without a pilot that's ever done a test on how to fly these things. We do these things so we learn, so we can be more safe. And that's, to me, if I look at the plan broadly, it's the lens is, here is permission to go and figure out what AI can do for you. Here's the permission to go and experiment and explore, but the onus is on you to learn, build confidence, build capability, build fluency, invest in your people, invest in your business. It won't just happen for you. AI won't suddenly make you a more effective, more economically viable business. You have to do it. And here are a few simple steps, but we're not building laws yet because we want you to develop this opportunity for yourselves.
And that's the part I love most about the approach that we've taken here in Australia. And I talk a lot about it on this podcast, that I think a lot of people are looking for someone to take responsibility for the technology so that they don't have to take the personal responsibility. And, that shows up in society in a lot of ways now. But whether AI makes us smarter or dumber, whether it's used for good or evil, is up to us. That is a personal responsibility that we each
100%.
have, and it's a choice that we get to make. Say to me, the technology is evil or the government should do something. It's like, well, one, you don't have to use it, but two, when you do use it, you're the one that's responsible for how you use that technology. And that's where I think that education and AI literacy around, really taking the opportunity to use it to create more impact, to increase productivity rather than just outsource what we do to AI. Once people start to get that nuance, that's where they really start to see the benefits of AI.
I agree.
So looking ahead, when it comes to the National AI Plan and the work that you're doing at the National AI Centre, what are some of the tangible changes that Australian businesses can expect to see as a result of all the work you're doing? So whether that's data centres or education or funding, or what does this mean for businesses here in Australia?
So there's two pieces to that, because you touched on data centers. But let me start with sort of the piece that I have some degree of control over, which is the National AI Centre's work. So we're broadly structured in delivering two things going forward for industry. So it's important to note, as we've talked a lot about the National AI Plan, this is the first time that we've been able to operate in this country as the National AI Center with a plan in place. We've previously been sort of trying to do best case scenarios and do what we think is right, but now we have a plan, now we have a vision, and there's some things that we need to deliver on that. So for us, the team is split into two functions, one of which is what we call our industry engagement sort of business, which is where we both listen to industry, talk to industry about what's going on, and try to build a sort of a feedback loop of here's what we're learning, and we want to share that with you, industry, so you're better equipped to know what's happening in AI and what risks exist or what opportunities exist. And we also want to hear from industry, because we now provide an opportunity for the government with a capital G being us, to hear what industry needs and to be able to react to that. And having the plan in a sense where we haven't made fixed boundaries, we've sort of made it adaptable, we can provide that lens. So half of what the NAIC does is about listening and understanding and figuring out how to meet the needs of industry going forward. So that's what I want industry to expect from us, is we might come knocking on their door to say, hey, we need your consultation. We want your time. We want to understand what's working for you, what's not, where are you seeing challenges, do you work with this? It's building that bigger picture. The other side of the National AI Center's work is on guidance and fluency. So how do we then build the tools that help people fill those gaps or keep moving forward? So most recently, in October last year, we published the guidance for AI adoption, or what we call the AI 6, because we like the alliteration of our Essential 8 and our AI 6. I think it's a great way to simplify things. As Australians, we do like to kind of keep things in that simple way. But it's 6 simple steps that you take to ensure that you're building the kind of the people practices, the governance practices that will mean you're doing all the right stuff when you choose to deploy AI. So it's simple stuff like, do you have someone who's looking at where your AI tools are coming from and the data they use? Do you have some degree of transparency you can share with your customers so they know how and where you're using AI? What's the get out of how do customers break out of your AI and talk to you if they're having any issues with it? Stuff like that. Simple guidance. And we'll continue to evolve that guidance and develop it as the technology improves or changes, as new services get built here in Australia, hopefully. We get new technology, new products, new offerings on the market. And so the industry on that side of it can expect to see us talk to them, get their feedback, and then react to that feedback and create more and better guidance. And that might be, taking our AI 6 and building something that really talks to the legal industry's consideration. Because, guidance is broad, but when you get to an industry like legal or like retail or like, finance, you've got to be a bit more specific. So working with those bodies to help tweak that to be a much more fit for purpose set of guidance is the work that we're going to be doing. And I think that's a kind of an ongoing, almost like a flywheel of information flow. As we learn more, we develop better, see how that tests, and then we figure out what works, and the technology is going to change around us, and we continue to build these mechanisms. The sole goal being that any person in Australia who wakes up one morning as a small business owner, or as an employee, or wherever they sit in the working ecosystem, they say, you know what, I think I want to give this AI a go. They know that the place they go to get started is us. They go to the National AI Center, they will get use cases, they'll get guidance, they'll get basic steps, they'll get access to fluency and literacy training courses, all the things they need, and some visibility of the risks, so we're not kind of, hiding them from that. So that's the work that we do. The bigger piece, and I think talks to your point around the sort of data center question and where we might see the National AI Plan as a whole lead us towards. I think what we're going to see is this, I hope at least, we're going to start to see a sort of rapid development of the edges of what society and the industry regulators are willing to allow as the operating model for AI. And I think what I learned, and I get this was part of my role at Microsoft, and I see it very clearly, is it's really easy in something like AI where it's not just a technology, as we said at the head of the show, it is something unique and different. It behaves in ways that we find somewhat concerning because it's human-like in its interactions with us. It tries to communicate with us in ways that feel very, I'm not anthropomorphizing it, but it is that sense. So developing the edges, knowing what is high risk or things we don't tolerate, and knowing what we consider to be fairly tolerable, very low risk, that's easy. It's the squishy bit in the middle about how we manage everything that is less well-defined. Health is a great example. Is something that is a challenge for the country economically, as well as, scale and everything else. We need better ways to do it. People are terrified of AI being brought into that health scenario. People are genuinely worried about AI doctors and AI sort of diagnoses. But if we don't find a way to do that, we're going to hit a different problem, which is scale. We can't meet the needs of all Australians. So we know we've got to solve that problem, but that's, there's a lot of complexity in that one. So I think I would hope, and I think this is a thing that the government alone isn't doing. This is, again, back to that point of the plan being a collaborative plan, is that we're going to try and figure this out and build those edges and get clear about what we can tolerate and try and figure out how to do the squishy bits in the middle. But we need to do that with industry, with science and research, with government, with academia, with civil society, with all of the players. And that's why it's just so important that we keep having very open-minded discussions about something that we maybe don't fully understand, but we're willing to learn and take ourselves on that journey, I think.
Yeah, one of the things we've touched on just around the edges is this issue around data security, some of the concerns that people have around AI. So data sovereignty, where data is being sent, where it's stored, and privacy concerns, which you were just touching on in that health example. And they're often the reasons why Australian businesses or businesses in general are hesitating to adopt AI, or they're kind of the barriers that stop them embracing that opportunity, especially when it comes to cloud-based tools and large language models. So from your perspective, how justified are those concerns? And I was careful about how I phrased that question because I have my own opinions about this, of course, but I'm interested in your
Yes.
opinion on how businesses approach that.
And everybody has an opinion on this one. I find it's sort of the cornerstone of it. Look, I think, my overarching statement here is it is no right of mine, or I'm in no position to question someone's fears or concerns about anything to do with the way that technology encroaches in their life. People's fears are always real to them and perceived to them and are born out of not, some false sense. It's because they don't know enough, or they are not exposed to it, or somebody hasn't taken enough time to help that person understand the full picture there. So there's no blame to be apportioned here. I think people genuinely have a concern about it. I think that Australia has actually taken a fairly hard line on things like copyright, for example. The government recently made some very clear statements that we're not going to change copyright laws to, accommodate model training and so on. Australia doesn't have a text and data mining exception to our copyright laws, so there's no way for sort of model building to occur in the way that we traditionally today think about it. And, underpinning all of those issues of questions like that, and that's very specific to the large language model, generative AI kind of world, is we just don't actually have a very clear set of laws to define this. And these are things that are probably going to be tested in courts around the world to figure out what they actually mean and how we think about them. But I want to come back to, if you take AI out of the picture and just talk about the importance of any organization using data to service their customers and deliver a product or a service to a market, the obligation for data safety, data security, to risk control, to reduce the dangers, as we've seen so prolifically around the world, and of course quite acutely here in Australia, of data proliferation, data leakage, and data theft. That role is irrelevant of AI's role here in the world. I mean, AI adds a lens of what might happen with that data, but fundamentally, I think we should hold all accountable who hold data on our behalf to look after that data in ways, because we just live in a world today where data isn't just a record so we can sell you a product or transact with you. It has a huge intrinsic value in the black market and in other means and ways that we know bad actors will continue to do in the world. This is, the nature of humanity as a global challenge. So that I think is not an AI problem. That is just a pure necessity of any business.
Can I add something in? Can I just flesh that out a tiny bit more? Because one of the biggest challenges that we see in working with all sizes of businesses is that they're approaching AI and data security and safety and data sovereignty with the same lens for personally identifiable information, proprietary information, and tasks that don't require access to any of that sensitive data. And it's one of the things we try to work with businesses is, what can you create out here, and we call it an AI operating system or a business brain, that allows you to plug in any AI platform without exposing all of that sensitive data. And I really think this is one of the biggest issues that businesses are grappling with now, is the one lens to look at AI through. And there's so much you can do. You can do 80% of a task without putting any of your proprietary information or sensitive data in, and then maybe take that somewhere where you've got more safety and security. But is that something that you're thinking about in your approach, I guess? Because a lot of that productivity comes from the repeatable, mundane tasks that are not touched by sensitive data. How do you see that?
Yeah. Look, it's something we think about, yes. I mean, and I think about the guidance, one of the things that we talk about in that guidance and governance is you have to ask yourself about the data you hold and the purpose you hold it for and the reasons you hold it for and the mechanisms by which you hold it. And in that expands that whole conversation about, do you really need this private data? Do you need to have personally identifiable information alongside non-personal identifiable information? Do you actually need, do you hold it for the period of time? I think it's not sort of a specific remit of the National AI Centre to think about that, because that's really a data and cybersecurity issue. And our friends at the Australian Cybersecurity Centre think a lot about that. And so we work quite closely with them because of this AI intersection of, AI does, of course, make action on data much easier and exposes the potentiality for a less sophisticated hacker, or for want of a better word, to use data in bad ways. And so it kind of opens up a bigger door for that. So yeah, we do think about it, but we don't own the problem in of itself. It does raise this question that you sort of mentioned in your early piece there, which is we've sort of become very lazy in the way we think about building systems today. My 81-year-old mum was commenting to me just the other day that, why do I have to log in and create an account for everything I do? I just want to, she was traveling to New Zealand. Why do I need to get an account to get a visa? Why can't I just get a visa? We can get into that world, but we do get lazy. Everything requires all this information. And I think we've sort of allowed an environment to exist where that's just normalized. And I think we're starting to see a lot of that pushback now. And and AI has been I think a force engine behind that pushback for people to think about the risks. So I think there's a coming together of all of these issues, but I think it's important not to sort of villainize AI as being the problem here. AI is a mechanism that can take advantage of poor practices in cyber and data security systems. If we're not managing the data properly, the data gets extruded and taken out, or we build capacity for somebody, not intentionally even, to just connect two data sets together because it makes their product delivery much easier. And they have inadvertently created both the privacy, as they may have broken a privacy law, but also created a scenario where the data is much richer. And I think it's education. This comes back to that fluency in education piece. There's one side of the fence, which is people have come to believe that if you put private information into an AI system like ChatGPT, that it will suddenly become part of the model, and suddenly that private information exists on the internet, and then anyone can extract it and use it. And you and I know, and you understand how models are built, how tokenization works, how all that happens. That's not the case. That doesn't mean that a company, I won't name any names, but a company might be saving your conversations to understand how people interact with it, and therefore your private information has been seen by somebody that shouldn't have seen it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly your credit card number is on the internet. I think then that we've made these huge leaps of fear from using AI means information is getting stolen. So I think we've got that problem, which sort of exacerbates this whole data security issue. And then the sovereignty issue and the sort of the need for us to hold this as an Australian only, like it's safer if it's here in Australia. I'm sorry to tell you, from a data security point of view, it's no safer here as it is in any other country. There's a different problem to be solved around sovereignty and the true nature of that, which is Australia's ability to operate independently of other interventions as a country to use this technology and operate it for its own national good. Different argument, very important to think about that, something else. So that's, to me, the sort of underlying piece here is not to diminish the trust that is needed, the risk that exists, and the importance of collecting data in safe and proper ways are all critical, but it's not necessarily just about AI. And we've conflated so many things when we talk about data security, privacy, sovereignty, AI, and all these things, that I think we almost need to take a step back, and really start to use a better language to define these things so that we can build better constructed sort of rules and regulations, or just simply operate in better ways because we understand what we're operating with.
Yeah, and I guess just to flesh out where I was going before, because it kind of ties into the next question I want to ask you. I do really think that a major unlock for businesses is separating that out of where AI touches sensitive information and where it doesn't need to, and actually building systems Because one of the things that we are seeing is that people are or enterprises in particular, can be very locked into a particular tech stack, whether that's Microsoft, which is predominantly where a lot of enterprise sits.
Yeah, I know that well.
You do. And maybe that's not the most advanced or innovative or, appropriate technology for some tasks within an organization. And so that ability to not be locked into one particular ecosystem, I think, is a major unlock. And we only work with clients who've got the potential to, move outside of just that one ecosystem, because it can be incredibly limiting and
Yes.
move your use of AI down a particular path. And when you're looking from an enterprise perspective of how do we get 10,000 people using AI, of course you're going to go to the tech stack that you're already using and, incorporate that. But that can be quite limiting when you look at what else is available outside of some of those ecosystems. So are you seeing some movement in that, or is it very, because I know what I'm seeing, but what are you seeing in terms of people's willingness to move outside, I guess, of their tech stack, and how do they approach those decisions?
Yeah, like, I'm glad you asked me this question, because it's funny how we have gone, I think I can say this full impunity now I don't work there. It's fair to say that 3, 4 years ago, you might have argued that Microsoft Copilot and OpenAI had the market. Like there was no competition to be run anymore. That market, they just were so fast, so quick. But of course, what we saw over the last 2 or 3 years is huge amount of competition, and good competition, and variations on a theme, and models that are now built for specific purposes. So you're absolutely right in that the ecosystem is now very broad and wide, and it's not just 65,000 versions of the same thing. There are actually really distinct nuances now. We talk about coding models and thinking models and language models and so on.
And
So I
agents.
think and of course, then we get into agents, and I was watching the other one, the Claude bot one, which is just sort of an offshoot of Claude, the one we like, versus the other one. Look, what I think your question actually opens up is this point about getting better about describing what we mean by adopting AI. Because the lens I have on this, when I talk to organizations about their AI adoption strategy, if you like, is it's almost in 3 pillars, because there is going to be the opportunity for you to adopt AI as a function of an existing product or service you buy from a vendor and continue to use every day in, day out, whether that be Atlassian, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, or anyone else. They're infusing AI into that technology, and it's sort of almost unavoidable. And there's value in that, as long as you understand the limitations of that value, in that sense. Copilot's great, as long as you keep it within the world of your email and Teams conversation, then it's really good at doing what it does. But, it's probably better than Claude would ever be to do that, because it's built for that purpose. But that's adopting AI into an existing business process, and it's going to bring you small to medium benefits. People are going to start just being a little bit more effective and efficient. There's another side of it, which is when you start to think about, as an organization, your maturity goes up, and you say, okay, so how do we bring AI into our business? Because we have this problem in our organizational flow. Data stops here, process stops here, we meet the expectations of market here. How do we do it differently that deviates from those products and services we've always done? And then they start looking at best fit for technology. And that's where I sort of introduced this conversation to them about the technology you're using is not the one that you have to use. The technology that you should be using is the appropriate fit for that role, that market, that space you're in. And then it opens up the door to the proliferation of any open source model, commercial model, another vendor, And then the last one is actually when you go, what, we're actually going to solve a new problem in the market, and AI is going to be our way to do it. We're actually going to build something new out of AI. So you're using it, you're transforming with it, or you're completely building something with it. And they are all different things. And
So, Lee, just on that issue of data sovereignty and where data is stored, we're seeing a lot of really interesting things at the moment with these major AI players like OpenAI and Anthropic and Grok making a lot of investment in Australia, and some building data centers and really increasing their presence here, which I imagine is to address some of those issues around security and data privacy and the data sovereignty. So, from your point at the National AI Centre, what does this wave of international investment mean for Australian businesses? And then even more around, how that influx of global capability and capital, how that's going to shape the dynamics here in Australia and opportunities, I guess, for Australian tech companies.
well, let me come straight out the gate and say, I think it's it's both very welcome that we see these organizations wanting to invest in Australia and wanting to work with us as a country and as a government to make these things happen. I think, there is, and it's tied a bit into that sort of sovereignty conversation we were having earlier about this issue of, well, if all the big American and global players come into the country, what room does that leave for Australian innovation and Australian players to live in that world? And I think I get where it comes from, but I think we often hear we use the word sovereign, and I like to say the word ecosystem after I say the word sovereign, because I think what's important for Australia to have is a sovereign ecosystem of players. And I think there's an equal need for us to have these big players come to our country and invest in our country, A, because it creates economic growth, investment, jobs, sort of generally contributes to our economy as a country. And I think, if I put my sort of broader government hat on, that is an important way in which we grow the market space for all Australians, is by having these technology players come to our country. We have to also acknowledge and recognize that when these companies are building their offices and building infrastructure here, they don't do it because we got nice food and we have pretty good weather halfway through the year. They do it because the market opportunity for them, they see, is there. And its nuance here is it's not just about Australia's market. You've got to keep in mind that we represent the Asia and the Asia Pacific market to them. And by the same token, we have a role as a sort of a constitutional role as a country in this region to work with our South Pacific partners and our South Pacific countries to help them take advantage of this technology. So I think they offer us a way to, I think about an organization, whether it be a not-for-profit or an organization in Australia that works across the South Pacific region. These are technology platforms that create space for them to do that in new and interesting ways. So I think it's net, it's a positive. There's always the balance of making sure we do it to the point that it's mutually beneficial. So it's good for them, but it's also good for us. And I think it doesn't close the door to our local innovation and our local contribution to that AI ecosystem. What I would always say to those companies that are doing this, and there's a few now, there's Main Code, there's Sovereign AI with Simon Chris and a few other organizations that are doing this, is this isn't about us sort of wanting to build our own OpenAI or ChatGPT so that we can turn off theirs and we can use our own and we don't need them anymore. That's not an approach to working in a global market. It's about looking at the opportunity that their technology provides us and saying, okay, with this new thing that they've given us access to, what can we build that is both needed for our market, unique to our market, and potentially in the future, something that we can sell to the world and create Australia's value in that ecosystem, in that chain of value? Because AI is in many ways, particularly in the large providers like Grok, Anthropic, Microsoft, and so on. Microsoft may be slightly different, but the AI platforms, they're just providing a platform that doesn't really do much until you actually turn it into a product, service, capability, or technology. And so Australian businesses should see this as access to more and more tools. And whether that's you're building a new AI product here in Australia, such as Main Code are doing, to solve a problem, fantastic. Create competitive markets, give the Australian market something to consider when their options are, do I go to Anthropic or OpenAI? Well, no, you might want to go to Main Code now. It may offer value to you. That's great to have markets, but not to build Main Code or as Matilda AI, so we can turn them out the country and turf them out and say we don't need you anymore. I think that's, and sometimes when we get to sovereignty, we get a bit caught up in this. I'm trying to think of the safest word to use, but the sort of at the expense of all others kind of approach to sovereignty, which is not the right approach. I think we need the full market. But from a national AI point of view and from a role in the government, what I want to see, if I could sort of cast my spell forward to the next 5 years, is I want to see a flourishing ecosystem of domestic and local technology here in Australia. And I want to see Australian companies both excitedly adopting AI and evaluating Australian products as well as they're evaluating overseas products and operating on a fair and global market. And I want to see more and more Australian AI models on the global stage. And I don't pick this as a specific example, but Australia leads the way in some areas. We have a world-class education system. We have a world-class health biosciences division and life sciences world. We have a world-class resources and minerals and mining industry. What are we taking advantage of there that actually creates sovereign wealth for us as a capability that we could be selling back to the world, because there's a market going on for AI globally, and we should be participating in it, not trying to shut ourselves off from it.
Absolutely. They're all yes, I really like some of those distinctions that you've made there. You know, having some Australianisms within AI wouldn't hurt either. If I could stop prompting, use UK English spelling, but in an Australian context, because you say use UK
Yeah.
English spelling and suddenly you get pounds and sterling through all of your.
You're absolutely right. And there's an interesting sort of side anecdote on this one, which is what I think people need to kind of recognize, is that people ask for, and there's a large cohort that would say, exactly what you've just said. AI doesn't talk like me, doesn't think like me. It's not Australian, doesn't understand my colloquialisms, or, and that's not just phrasing, but sometimes it's intentionality in how we think about things. It's just our sensibilities. In order for AI to be able to do that, and even more complexly, if we want AI to be inclusive of languages and diversity and the culture that we have as a country, it doesn't do that unless we give it the data and the information and the ability to do that. And so there's this really tough dichotomy of, I don't want to give you my data. You can't have all my information, whether that be cultural, indigenous, or otherwise. But I want your models to recognize I exist and engage with me on my. The two are, there's a middle ground, and I think that's a hard conversation, but an important one for Australia to have. Is, we want to be recognized. That requires us to participate, and participation requires thinking differently about our knowledge and our data and our contribution to that.
There are so many things in AI where we're weighing up either side and we're grappling with that, what does that bit in the middle look like, as you referred to earlier. One of the other areas that I am seeing quite a bit of innovation here in Australia that I'd love to just touch on is, and it's also one of the elephants in the room about AI, but a lot of people raise the issue of the environmental cost of AI. So particularly around energy consumption of data centers, model training, and it's getting a lot more attention now. It's certainly raised in every workshop that I run. I'm always asked, or every boardroom conversation, I'm always asked about the environmental impacts. What kind of innovation are you seeing in Australia to kind of tackle some of that sustainability challenge of AI? And have you got any great case studies of sort of new technology that's emerging out of Australia to help address these issues?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of things. I mean, frankly, that's a big enough topic of its own to have its own podcast entirely about the sort of the environmental impact of technology broadly. Look, I'm not an expert in climate science or, sort of the mechanics of all of this. I'm not going to try and pretend to sort of have the answer to it. But the issue is real. The question I ask myself often is, how real and how big is that problem? Not being qualified to talk about it, I look to others who have the knowledge of that. Look, what we know to be true is, on one hand, infrastructure like data centers and AI being a sort of a massive growth factor in that, do consume water and other sources of energy, other sources of consumption, power, water, and others. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed. There's a lot of arguments that would say that the concentration of data centers and the amount of money going into data center innovation in areas of power and water usage would imply that that problem is going to get solved much faster than if we just allowed sort of the problem to distribute outside of data centers and it wasn't being sort of concentrated. There's a concentration sort of power to when you do these things. The same thing was true of cloud computing in the sort of mid 2000s, in that it concentrated the efforts, but also concentrated all of the development of science in better ways to do power. So you get a mix of problem and solution at the same time. No one would argue that Australia has the potentiality to be a real pivot point in the move from traditional energy to renewable energies, just because of the nature of our land and where we sit in the globe. I'm not going to argue about how that should happen or if we're doing enough of it. That's definitely not my world. But look, to talk about what are we doing locally here, there's a couple of interesting things. So there's a company based in Tasmania that is now spreading across South and Southern Australia and up into other states, called Firmus, Firmus, who are rethinking the way that AI data centers are built, doing this in partnership with NextDC and a few other companies, but they're thinking about the green data center. So the best way to think about it is a data center that is net zero impact to the ecosystem in which it operates in. So, net zero impact on water, net zero impact on power. And they're not just thinking about this from a sort of a bolt on to the data centers of today. They're actually thinking about, they're building data centers specifically for AI infrastructure. So AI inference and AI training. and thinking about the way that power and water is needed. Because if you think about it, traditional cloud computer data centers that we've had for the last 2 decades need continual, constant power. The biggest concern is data loss or data, issues of that. So the data has to stay on. So we sort of over-engineer it for that. Whereas an AI data center actually needs different power consumption, different sort of models of power and water usage, because it's often first for training in huge quantities, and then nothing, and then very small pieces for inference as it's prompting things. So you can think about the problem differently. That's exactly what Firmus are doing. Australian company thinking about this in our country and leaning very much into the uniqueness of our geography and our sort of ecosystem and climate. So that's one to go look at. And the other one that I would call out that, is where we can't necessarily change the physics of the planet in so much as, water's a finite resource, data centers are big infrastructure that require concrete and steel and all these things. And, at some point, physics clashes with reality. We are seeing these sorts of partnerships or developments. And I think the announcement that NextDC and OpenAI did in December, which was their big $7 billion investment in the country and a massive amount of impact, sustainable design was right at the center of it. So I think we are seeing, whether you agree with it, so it's enough or not, that the data center companies, the AI, and in particular the AI companies, interesting in this case, it's not NextDC who own the sort of the physical, infrastructure, but it's the companies that are actually building the AI logic, and also companies like NVIDIA that are building the chips. Sort of all pieces of the ecosystem are thinking about the sustainability problem. And I think that can only be a good thing in the long term.
Yeah, and we've had companies like Microsoft and OpenAI coming out and, with statements saying that they'll make sure that their data centers do not have a negative impact on the communities that they're
Sure.
building in. And I think it's certainly a space to watch here in Australia, because I can see that somewhere where we could really lead a lot of those solutions around data centers that you're talking about, because it is a
I
major
agree.
concern. It's probably the biggest concern that gets raised, in all the conversations that I have. Lee,
Totally.
there are so many other things I would love to talk to you about. And maybe you'd consider coming back in 6 months,
Of
or
course. Of course.
I'd love to go a bit deeper on some of the topics that we've talked about. But I always like to ask, and you have touched on this already, but if you look out ahead, and it's hard to look out 5 years ahead, but if you look out
Mhm.
ahead now, if Australia really gets this right, what is it that our future looks like if we really get the AI adoption and integration piece right in our country?
Okay. And I did sort of, I'll give a different answer to the one I gave before, because this one's probably more personal from my point of view. As I mentioned earlier, I've got a 19-year-old son and a 16-year-old daughter. And if I think about the next 5 years and I think about the world that they are going to grow up into and how different and complex yet empowering and potential for them to know and have access to information and be able to tap into systems and develop skills and build a life for themselves in a way that is incomprehensible to my parents and pretty incomprehensible to me. That's the opportunity I would like to see. I'd love to see a point in the future in 5 years' time where we are not having the discussions about whether or not we should be using AI and is it the right thing to do, but we're actually in a world where my son is telling me that he's now in charge of X, doing Y, and he's learned how to do something entirely new because he works with AI day in, day out. And I think it's that little change for me. We always want something better for the next generation. And I think that's our opportunity here right now with AI. Old people like me have the opportunity to set a world sort of a map for Australia, kind of a strategy that gives him that opportunity that I can't even imagine what it would be like.
My children are 10 and 12, and I can't imagine what they're what they're going to graduate into. And
It'll be different from my 19-year-olds. I mean, that's the difference now in the world, 9 years apart, and who
yeah,
knows? So yes,
and
it's
they're actually
exciting.
the ones that I feel for at the moment, is those ones going into that, that first part of their working life with so much opportunity, but also so much uncertainty. So I'm sure your children are very grateful to have someone like you guiding them through that.
Doesn't
My
feel
children
like it all
love
the
that
time,
their
but
mum
yes.
does AI.
Yeah, and I'm not sure yet if they're grateful, but yes. But we have a duty. We have a
Yeah,
responsibility to do that.
absolutely. Yeah, my
Awesome.
10-year-old was telling people the other day that I invented AI, so I definitely needed to
Oh,
correct her on that.
yeah. Take that.
Take the win while I've got it.
For
Thank you
sure.
so much, Lee, for your time today. I have really enjoyed our conversation, and I definitely will be inviting you back onto the podcast as this
Look
emerges.
forward
And
to
it's
it.
been really great to have a lens on Australia because, a lot of the conversation, a lot of the nuances can be lost in terms of what's happening here in Australia. So I've really been, really appreciate the ability to go deeper on that. So how do people reach out to the National Eye, or what's the best way for them to connect?
The best way is probably NAIC, NAIC, at industry.gov.au. That's our sort of general catch-all mailbox. But if you really want to talk to me about something, you can find me on LinkedIn and my name, and I'm very easy to find. I'm not hidden, so you can always just reach out to me there as well.
Wonderful. And we look forward to seeing how the National AI Centre evolves and yes, definitely need another conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Look forward to it. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Lee. Thank you for tuning in to the AI Grapple. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. We would love to hear your thoughts, so reach out with any questions or comments about the show. Until next time, keep grappling with AI and stay curious.